Okay, let's get going here. So thanks for joining our webinar, Musical Instrument Insurance 101, How to Protect Your Instruments. So we hope that everyone has been keeping well, first of all. Many of you likely know about Front Row already, but just to provide some context on the company to people who aren't already Front Row customers, Front Row provides insurance and risk management consulting services for the entertainment industry. We operate out of 7 offices across Canada and the US. Our senior account executives have over 20 years of experience providing expertise wherever and whenever needed. Front Row specializes in providing insurance solutions for a number of sectors, including the one that we'll be focusing on today, which is musical instruments. But of course, we also do a lot of work in the film production space. So just an introduction here. I'm Grant, VP of Marketing at Front Row, and I'll be your moderator for the webinar. I have about 9 years experience in the insurance industry and marketing roles, and I joined Front Row in 2019. Diane Konechny, Executive Vice President at the Toronto branch, began her insurance career working in claims and then moved over to being a broker in 1994. At that time, she was doing commercial insurance for several large insurance brokers. In 1999, she began working for Jones Brown, focusing on insurance for the entertainment industry. Diane had a passion for the industry and had studied film and television in school. Diane moved over to Front Row when the entertainment division from Jones Brown joined with Focus Insurance. She continues to focus on providing policies for large and small productions and any entertainment-related industries. Rob Gugg is Senior Account Executive, also in Toronto. He studied animation at Sheridan and film and TV production at Humber. So he talks the talk and walks the walk, and with over 16 years of insurance experience behind him, he knows what a studio needs to keep the creative flow happening. So here's just an overview of the webinar. Today we'll explain instrument insurance. We'll also go into talking about some tips and tricks to protect your musical instrument gear. Protecting instruments at home and at airports we'll discuss as well. Protecting your guitar, drums, keyboard, violin, and saxophone we'll discuss specifically. And we will talk about the musical instrument insurance program from Front Row. We'll talk about claims a little bit, and there should be some time for questions at the end. So the information provided in this webinar is to be used as general reference only and is not intended as advice for any particular situation. In all cases, actual coverage is subject to policy language, terms and conditions in the long-form policy documents issued by the insurance companies, and not all advice in this webinar will necessarily be covered under a musical instrument insurance policy. And so with that, I'll let Rob take over.
Thanks, Grant. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So as Grant said, we are going to be talking about the musical instrument program with Front Row. Next slide, Grant.
Yep.
So musical instruments insurance, this program we have, it's primarily available online through the Front Row website. And some of the basic reasons would be why we need musical instrument insurance or why you need musical instrument insurance. The property protection covers you against damage and loss to your musical instruments, unexpected costs or extra expenses, which we'll delve into a little bit later with regards to in the event you're renting new instruments or if your instruments are damaged, unusable, stolen, destroyed. And then loss of equity or value in instruments. There is a possibility to get a stated amount for those rare or increased in value musical instruments, which we can address again at a later date, but it is possible. Next slide. So tips and tricks to guard your gear. we won't go into every single, obviously, if you guys are if you guys are musicians, you probably have a better understanding as to how to protect your gear. But we've added a couple of best practices here for your equipment. Obviously, if you've made that investment, you want to protect it to the best of your ability. And that does go a long way when you're submitting a claim to the insurance company. Here's obviously some details with regards to how to protect your gear. Next slide. Keep records. So this is also going to be very crucial when you are submitting a claim. Records are going to be your main source when you're dealing with a claims adjuster, what they're going to be asking for in the event of a claim. And it could be loss through damage, theft. One of the main things that you're going to be submitting when we approach an insurance company for a claim is our pictures of your instruments, boxes of your instruments, serial numbers of your instruments. One of the sort of best practices I use with some of my clients is to advise them that if you're keeping these records, you may want to also keep it in a offsite storage, so something like the cloud, either in an Excel spreadsheet or with your photos, just in the event that there is something catastrophic like a fire or a flood and everything is all destroyed. You don't then want to have to begin trying to find copies of all that stuff again if everything was all situated in the same place and it was a total sort of catastrophic loss in the event of, like I said, a fire or a flood. Next slide. So again, same sort of idea, protecting your instruments at home. These are, again, some best practices. Alarm and deadbolts is probably one of the most common ones in the event that there's a break-in, or again, theft is something that always seems to come up. In the event of a claim, you would have to submit a police report, and that's part of the claim submission would be the police report number, badge number, and incident report from your local police station. Next slide.
All right, I can take this over, Rob. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. And just one of the things I wanted to add to what Rob was saying in terms of protecting your instruments is one thing to remember is the policy has what's called a locked vehicle warranty, meaning if you leave your doors unlocked on your car, or if you're unloading gear from a van or a car or what have you at a location, there's no coverage on the policy if there is theft from an unattended and open vehicle. So if there's no signs of forced entry to the vehicle, there wouldn't be coverage under the policy. So, we'll talk about some other protection methods a little later on, but, it's just something to keep in mind is, not leaving the car unlocked with your items if you're, on your way somewhere and make a stop, or again, like I said, if you're unloading the gear at a venue when you're performing. So some other protections when you're going traveling. I know most of us probably haven't been anywhere in a while, but when things open up and if people are traveling with their instruments, is just to make sure that if you're able to use them as a carry-on as opposed to checked luggage. I'm sure now, especially with confusion at airports, probably more than ever, is things can get lost in transit, and the last thing you want to do is find out your instrument's not there when you get to your destination. If they need to search the instruments, is just to get there earlier. They should be in hard-bodied or packaged properly in order to make sure that they're not damaged if they have to be checked luggage, and obviously to stay close to your property while you're at the airport. We have had incidences where you turn your back and something's gone very quickly, and then some people are going with getting the tile or similar tracking devices and including that in their cases. just so that some things are easily trackable. Now, whether you get it back or not, you know, it's harder to say, but at least it leaves you with some sort of way to potentially look for your things in the event that they do get stolen. Next slide. There's several instruments that we're going to give some tips on how to protect them. So this may or may not apply depending on what instruments you might use. But you know, storing your guitar in you know, a centralized room as opposed to one where there's a draft or certain things. Obviously, these things can be sensitive to temperature change. You know, having the straps be sufficient for what you're doing to protect your guitar from like potentially dropping. Belt buckles I know are a big issue because they can scratch on the back. So again, looking out for those things. Keeping your instrument clean just because it can lengthen the life of the instrument. And again, you know, when you're traveling, is just packaging it correctly, you know, potentially extra padding and other things to prevent it from sliding around in the case. Next slide. Drums, again, there's certain things when you're storing the drums just to extend the life of them is, you know, the tension on them. And again, hard cases for each drum so it's properly protected. And again, when you're looking at storing them and when you're traveling with them, it's just having the proper casing just to make sure that they're not damaged while in transit. And just again, if you know, you can't, with drums, obviously, you can't have those carry on. So it's just looking at how you're going to be transporting them as freight or something like that. If you can pay the extra benefit or the extra amount rather to make sure that they're handled professionally. Or else there's the option of obviously looking into renting a drum kit where your gig is instead of flying your own back and forth. One thing to note on any of these things is that, you know, the damage to any instrument is for damage itself. It's not wear and tear. So if, you know, things like, you know, regular scratches or things like that, just from use of an instrument, just over time, everything wears out. So those things aren't covered. It's just, you know, if there's water dropped on something and it causes damage like a keyboard, or if there's theft, or again, like Rob said, if there's potentially a fire, things like that would be covered. Next slide. Again, keyboards, again, there's been some information about where, again, to keep it in terms of temperature. You know, checking the outlets. Of course, when you're at home, you're probably fine, but if you're plugging into an electrical outlet at a bar or any other venue that you might be using, you just want to make sure that the outlets are fine so that it doesn't short circuit things and it's the proper voltage. Again, cleaning it properly with the correct solvents or whatever you might need to use to clean your instruments. And of course, you know, there is the potential, as I mentioned, of things falling on it. And obviously, liquids would be an issue for a keyboard. So being aware of where you put things or what you put close to a keyboard is important. A saxophone. Oh, that's okay. You can go to the next one. Thanks, Grant. Again, temperature, another thing that is a potential detriment to a saxophone. Again, where to hold the saxophone. And as Rob said, you know, whatever instrument you're using, you're probably more of an expert on it than we might be. But again, just some reminders, you know, how to properly use it, store it, and you know, use it when you're performing. In terms of neck straps and, you know, cleaning it again after it's been used just to make sure that there's no issue with it. Next slide. Again, violin, same sort of thing in terms of temperature, and how it should be stored, just to keep it, to protect it. Animals again can cause an issue in terms of how they treat an instrument or something. I don't know if any of you had gotten the urge to buy to get a rescue or a dog during this time, but puppies do have a temptation to chew on things, so obviously leaving something out in the open in that situation is not the best. And again, getting a case to properly store it, and ideally a waterproof case would be the best to protect it from any dust and water. Next slide. All right, Rob, did you want to take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So all that being said, you can see the website right there, the link for the musicians.frontrowinsurance.com. So that's one of our more popular products, and it actually is very, very simple. I think within 6 to 7 steps, you can purchase a policy and get your documents emailed to you right away. One of the main components that you'll see at the bottom there where it says you may not be covered under homeowners. Each homeowner's or tenant's policy would be different, and you may be surprised that a lot of homeowners policies or tenants policies would have sublimits on your musical instruments. So they could be as low as $1,000, $1,500. And that doesn't just necessarily mean the musical instruments. Could also be camera equipment, could also be computer equipment, cash for sure, jewels, anything like that. So if you do have a homeowner's policy or a tenant's policy, definitely review that to find out what your limitation is on that policy, because it may urge you to at least take a look at one of the quotes through the online process, especially if you have a bunch of musical instruments or sound equipment, could be in excess of $5,000, $10,000. You'll realize that in the event of, again, something catastrophic, you may be left a little bit short if you're relying on your homeowner's policy. Again, our policy online is for an annual or 12-month period. Next slide.
Sorry, I just want to add to that too, Rob. It's just that the other thing is that if you are operating a business and you're gaining income from your musical instruments, or quite honestly, any other type of business, is a lot of homeowners and tenants policy also exclude any property used for business purposes. Some of them have the ability to add on coverage for that. But most you'll find will exclude that. So it's just something to keep in mind for any property used for generating income.
Yeah, that's right. Good point, Diane. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see we haven't included every single association that is eligible for purchase online, but here are some of the main ones. Obviously, SoCan on the far left. The policy would be Canada, US. So you'll see we've just taken a small snippet of associations. If you're familiar with this site, I think the first question will be, what province are you from? The next question essentially is a drop-down box where it has at least in excess of, last time I counted, 15, maybe 20 at this point, musical associations that allow you to be eligible to purchase online. Next slide. So here are some of the comparing questions that you would want to ask with regards to if you already have a policy for your musical instrument or your musical type business. Is there a minimum premium? So you'll see when you go through our online process, premiums are going to vary depending on valuation. So if you've got $5,000 worth of equipment, your premium most likely is going to be lower than somebody with $50,000 worth of equipment. It's pretty straightforward. But you'll find that some companies will charge you a minimum of $500, even if you're only insuring up to $2,000 worth of instruments. So the biggest takeaway I would say from the webinar would be, if you've not taken a look at the site, definitely try it out. You can get a quote within 2 minutes, and it's very, very simple. Some of the other benefits for our program would be office contents. So if you do, in this day and age, I think for the last 2 years, most people are running their business from home. But you'll see if you run your music business from your home, your computer, your printer, I don't know if anybody still uses a fax machine, filing cabinets, things that are very typical to a home office or business office may not be covered under your tenants or homeowners policy, but you would see a sub-limit on our policy, similar to valuable papers and accounts receivable records, as well as coverage for borrowed musical instruments. Borrowed could constitute rented. If this coverage isn't in your current policy, or definitely not in your homeowner's policy, it is available on our online program. Next slide. There's a very common question here as well, is where and when is the equipment covered? What territory? I don't know about anybody else, but I've seen a lot of movement in terms of people moving from one location to another location, province to province. Our policy is on a limited worldwide basis. So again, there are stipulations, but for the majority, limited worldwide would be definitely Canada, definitely the US. With your existing policies, if you are traveling, while you're traveling, you would have coverage with our policy. And again, the biggest takeaway I would say is take a look at, if you do have an existing policy, maybe do a comparison between your existing policy and getting a quote through our online process. So some frequently asked questions or common questions here. Do you require a schedule of my equipment? The answer is no. However, I would suggest this always with one of my clients. It's always a good idea and probably going to be a requirement in the event of a claim that you would have records or schedule of your equipment. Again, further to one of the previous slides, I always recommend my clients either keep an Excel spreadsheet, definitely photos, possibly boxes, receipts, anything else that would constitute proof of ownership of an instrument, and also something that people don't necessarily take into account. If we're involved in a theft and you've got a copy of your serial numbers, you can submit those with your police report. It also helps them in the event that they were to find these instruments to compare serial numbers. Hey, this was Joe's serial number from a police report and we found it at this location. So it is something that I would consider a best practice. And again, one of the other things is we would not require it for a schedule or a quote, your schedule of equipment, but it is good to keep that stuff in the event of a claim. You would need to provide that to the claims adjuster. Vintage instruments is an interesting one. We would require an appraisal. We don't necessarily need that online, but if it's something of a high value, we would expect that you have an appraisal done on what is the replacement value of that instrument. Because again, some of these instruments will increase in value as things progress. So it is something that we would highly recommend if you're looking for coverage for a vintage piece of equipment.
Yeah, and just the thing to keep in mind is that, again, if it's an antique or if it's something like that, it has to be a current appraisal. So current to us means in the last 5 years. So if something is older than 5 years old, we need to have another updated appraisal, because the valuation or the way the insurance company pays for any replacement is the replacement cost. So the cost to buy something that is the same item or like kind and quality is how they put it. So used for the same purposes. So another thing to keep in mind is when you're purchasing the coverage is not necessarily what you purchased it for. So if you bought it from, an individual through Kijiji or another, another similar website, then, to replace it, you're not necessarily going to get the same price, or you're not going to be able to purchase it for the same price. So you want to make sure it's what it is to replace it, and that's what you should be insuring it for. All right, we can go to the next slide, Grant. Okay, and as I mentioned, like, again, the insurance company's on replacement cost, and that's why you need to make sure that you are putting the correct amount in there, because there is a co-insurance clause in a policy. And what a co-insurance clause means, that you have to carry a certain limit. So it's usually 80, 90, or 100%. So it can be, it has to be that full value. Otherwise, you're not insuring to value, so the insurance company wouldn't pay you the full amount of the claim. So here's kind of an example of that. So, if you purchase coverage on a replacement cost basis for $60,000, but the actual value, should a claim arise, is $100,000. So there, obviously, you're not insured to full value. You're not even insured to necessarily the 90% coinsurance that is required by the policy. So, because that would be obviously $90,000. And if the amount of the loss is $50,000, you would basically only get proportionate amount of what you insured to. So, again, at this point, you might get 60% of that. So you're not going to be made whole or even close to whole for what you're doing. So again, the adjusters will look at, several things, as Rob said. When they're adjusting the claim, they're looking at what the value is to replace, the ownership of it, and, what the overall limit that you require. Now, if it's something small, typically they're not going to go through the whole process of looking at, what your overall limits should be. But on a significant loss, they're going to go through the whole process and get, how much equipment do you have, what's the replacement cost of everything, and to make sure you're satisfying the requirement on the policy for coinsurance. And this is not, only on this policy. This is a standard clause that's on all insurance policies. Next slide. All right, so there are several coverage enhancements that are included as part of the policy. These are throw-ins basically with the insurance company. So changing the limit down or taking this out is not going to change the pricing on the policy. So as Rob mentioned, the coverage territory is worldwide. Now, again, there's certain economic or trade sanctions with certain countries. Most insurance companies are owned by U.S. parents. Therefore, places like Cuba, Syria, Iran, anywhere there's any kind of sanctions, the insurance companies can't operate in those locations, so there wouldn't be coverage in those locations. So again, if you're traveling somewhere where you think there might be an issue, that's something that you'd want to, double check and make sure. I don't know that many people would go to Syria or Iran, but Cuba obviously is a popular destination. So you just definitely want to check on that before you go. There is, as Rob was saying before, there are some throw-ins for office contents coverage. So that covers things like your, if you have a desk or a photocopier or anything like that, or any tenants improvements done to the space that you're operating in. There's $10,000 of rental reimbursement coverage. So if any musical instrument equipment that you have insured are covered by a loss, and that's the thing to remember, it has to be a covered loss. The insurer will reimburse you for their reasonable rental expenses to rent substitute property to continue operations while it's being repaired or replaced. Next slide. And then another component of the policy that is available is general liability. And general liability covers you for bodily injury or property damage to third parties. So that's not you, that's someone else, caused by your operations as a professional musician. And that's the one thing to keep in mind, is it doesn't cover you for doing, if you're, you're buying this policy because you're a musician, but you have some other type of occupation and you cause injury or damage to property, that's not covered by this policy. This is specific to you as a musician. And that coverage also includes the cost of a lawyer to defend you. This doesn't cover for a touring exposure. So basically a tour is something that has a defined start and date with, different locations or different venues or gigs throughout the year. So it's something that you set up. It's not necessarily like you have one show here and there on occasion. So it would have to be a specified tour. And it doesn't cover you if you own a commercial recording studio. And a commercial recording studio would be you're generating income from the operations of the recording studio. So if you are renting it out to other individuals, if you are bringing people in to record them, so that would be a separate policy that you'd need to do. Obviously, the insurance companies look at these things as bigger exposures. If you have a recording studio where you're just recording yourself, that's not going to be as big an issue as if you have people coming through on a regular basis. All right, next slide.
I'm going to jump in here, Diane.
Go right ahead, Rob.
Yeah. So what to do in the event of a claim? Hopefully that never happens, but that's ultimately the reason why you're buying this policy. As I said, the more information that you can provide to your claims adjuster, the smoother the transition would be in regards to getting payment and also the smooth operation of you either repair or replacing your piece of equipment or musical instrument. Common things are going to be date the incident occurred, description of what happened, where it happened, when it happened. Approximate amount of loss might be difficult. It always depends on the nature of the claim. So if it was a complete and total loss, a lot easier to determine than, hey, this thing is broken. What's it going to cost to fix? I have no idea. So that might be something that could be TBD. And then obviously name and phone number of yourself or the person to contact with the insurance adjuster. They'll make phone calls. Sometimes they'll do simply by email. But each incident of claim should be reported as soon as it's known. You don't want to wait on something like that. If in doubt, again, you can always email the site. You could email Front Row directly to find out what the next steps are. Deductibles. A lot of people may not know there is a deductible on the policy. What that means is basically what you're going to retain prior to submitting a claim. So if your deductible is $1,000 as an example, and you have $500 worth of damage, you wouldn't qualify to make a claim. You would want to ensure that your claim amount would exceed the deductible. But again, in the event that you're not sure, you can always reach out to someone at Front Row. And then in this last incident, who should I call first if I have a loss? Really depends on the nature, right? So if obviously there's a theft, probably don't want to call your insurance broker first. Definitely want to call the police first. Similar with a fire, don't call Front Row first. You probably want to call the fire department. However, once that process begins, then absolutely you want to let us know at your earliest convenience when it happens. And the details while they're fresh. Something that's not mentioned here as well would be general liability, or in the event somebody is injured. You may also want to get some witness statements, phone numbers as to what happened, how it occurred, if somebody was injured, call an ambulance, make sure they're taken care of. Those things are just common practices in the event of a claim. Next slide.
Sorry, just one thing too, Rob, that I want to add is that under the liability, you also don't want to just accept responsibility for something. You want to make sure that you get the details, like Rob said, of what the incident is if someone's been injured, but then let the adjuster look at the scenario. If it's something that, I know a lot of us, when something happens, you feel bad for someone and you want to say, I'm sorry, my fault, blah, blah, blah. Just you want to just get the details and then report it to us and let the insurance company determine, fault and that kind of thing. So you're not, kind of taking responsibility for something that you might not necessarily be responsible for.
Yeah, good point, Dan.
All right. Sorry.
That's okay. So, is it possible to take immediate action to make repairs if further damage to the property is likely? Again, as long as the claim is covered from the insurance company's standpoint, they don't want to necessarily pay for further damage. And again, I'm sure as most musicians I dealt with over the course of many years, they also are not looking to cause further damage to their instruments, especially if they're of a high inherent value. You want to use your best ability to make sure that it's not causing further damage or further issues with your instruments or equipment. And again, best practice, always advise at your earliest convenience in the event of a claim or damage. After any other type of loss here as well, you want to take immediate steps to protect the property from further damage. Photographs are always easier to explain. You know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. Definitely want to call your insurance broker for some guidance. And then again, some of the other areas here, police reports in the event of theft, fire department reports in the event of fire. Documentation is going to be king and key when you're submitting that information to your adjuster. And keeping an open line of communication. We've seen a bit of a delay over the course of the last 3-4 months, obviously with regards to pandemic and other things with claims. So it is good to keep a constant contact with your adjuster and find out, hey, are you waiting in any information from me? What are the next steps? And an open line of communication is always the best course of action to get things expedited. Next slide. So agreed value versus replacement cost. So this is where we were speaking previously about your, what do they call it? Appraisal for your equipment. So the policy is on a replacement cost basis. When you're asking, how is my gear going to be valued? It provides for the cost of repair or replace to the damaged property without depreciation. And when we spoke earlier about agreed value, again, you want to get an appraisal for those vintage, one-of-a-kind instruments. And again, as Diane had mentioned, your instrument is 5 years old. The appraisal cannot be 5 years old. You want to make sure you've got the most accurate and up-to-date appraisal so that you are getting the most accurate, up-to-date value on your equipment or musical instrument. Next slide.
Okay, all right, so I'll come back in here. So we do have this ebook that's available for free on our website at the URL that you see on the slide at the bottom, how to protect your instruments. So the ebook covers a lot of the same content that we covered in this webinar, but it also includes additional information and tips that we didn't get to today. So you can download the ebook for free by going to the URL that you see at the bottom of the slide. Included in the ebook is a coupon to save a bit of money on a front row instrument insurance policy if you don't already have one. So for the coupon code, just note that it's for Canada only, and it does exclude Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan for regulatory reasons. So we do have some questions here, so I'll get to the questions now. What extra insurance might be needed if you are selling an instrument and allowing possible buyers to take the instrument home?
Well, the one thing is that the policies don't cover the instrument if it's being loaned out to somebody else or in their possession. So if you are giving your instrument to somebody else to use or test, they should have their own insurance, and you should get verification that they have their own insurance, and as you might have seen, if you're leasing equipment or gear where a leasing company requires you to add them as a lost payee. In that situation, that's what you want to do. No insurance company is going to cover things while they're loaned out to other people, just because they have no control of it. They have no information on those individuals. So I just know that your policy doesn't cover that, and you need to make sure that the individuals are going to be responsible for it for any kind of loss or damage to it. I mean, you might even want to go so far as put something in writing, making them responsible for it, where you're both signing off on that.
Okay, how does an appraisal need to be in order to be considered current and or valid when making a claim for theft or damage?
So there are certain companies that will have, experienced appraisers, or some of the larger, like Steve's Music or some of the other stores, likely will either have someone in-house that can appraise something, or else could provide you likely with the name of a qualified appraiser. So that's what you're looking for. It's not, looking around in terms of, what does this cost here? What does it cost there? It's actually getting a written statement from an experienced appraiser or industry professional that does appraisals.
I think Long and McQuaid also does it at some of their locations too.
Yeah.
So if I don't have an alarm system for my apartment, all I have is the normal door locks, I'm not going to be insured or reimbursed in case of robbery?
So it's not a requirement to have the alarm, but it's something that is recommended, especially if you have lots of high valued equipment or instruments there that you obviously want to have the best protection for them. But it's not something that's necessarily a requirement on the policy.
If my vintage drum kit is basically similar value to a modern kit of the same quality, is that really necessary?
I'm assuming they're meaning the appraisal. So
Yeah, I would do, right?
Yeah.
That thing, if I've got a vintage drum kit that's worth the exact same as a modern day drum kit, do I need an appraisal?
Yeah. So if the replacement of a piece of equipment that is older, it's just, again, it's an older piece as opposed to something that is, has a higher value because it's antique, or if it's signed by someone, and then it has a higher value than a standard piece of gear, that's when you'd be looking for the appraisal. Because again, what that's verifying is that you're not going to get paid for less than the actual value of the item itself. Some things are not replaceable easily, so that's where you want to make sure you're getting the accurate amount and that you're insuring for the accurate amount. Because when you get an appraisal, they're going to give you, what their anticipated value of that item is.
With the insurance percentage, are we permitted to have specific instruments or items excluded from a policy so that they don't factor into the calculation? Thinking about myself with a large collection of instruments which stay at home, and I only gig with a small percentage of them.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that even if things are, you're looking to cover only things on the road, well, the unfortunate, circumstance could happen in your home. We've had, people who've had, if they're living in an apartment or a condo building, a leak in the building, and, from the suite above, that caused damage to things that were in the home. So you'd want to insure it for the full value of those things. And again, like Rob said, in the case of like a fire or something else, again, you're going to have a loss of those things, and that's when you're going to look to replace everything, and the co-insurance clause would come into play, and you wouldn't get paid for the actual value of your loss.
If I have a standard guitar, say a Martin D28, that is, say, 7 years old, do I need an appraisal, or because it's a standard guitar always in production, the replacement value would be okay without an appraisal?
Again, if you can get the same piece of equipment for the, readily available, then you can do the replacement cost. But again, if it's older than the 5 years old, then that's when you want to look at, like, again, is something that is it has a higher value just because of its the nature of it, then that's when you want to get the appraisals done. And again, all this is doing is making sure that you're going to get, in the event of a claim, get paid out for the value of the item itself, for the proper amount.
Okay. Do you have to itemize things like cables and strings and microphones and such? This can add up to several thousand quickly, but nothing is serialized and stuff on hand tends to come and go often.
Again, it's one of those things, if there's significant value to those, if you have a lot, so obviously with no serial numbers, but itemizing how many you might have, because you're going to want to look to replace those items as well. And you don't want to pay the amount of your deductible plus any extra things that you don't necessarily have listed out. So as Rob said, keeping a spreadsheet of your items and the approximate cost of them does help in keeping things clear for yourself. But again, in the event of a claim, having the backup information readily available to the adjuster and not having to figure things out and try and remember everything that you had that potentially could have been damaged. Obviously, we think worst case scenario in terms of a total loss. If you take your, if you have a couple instruments and a mic or something like that you have, it's not necessarily quite as important because you're going to know what you have. But when there's several items, you definitely would benefit from having that spreadsheet and all the information listed there.
Do you cover vinyl records?
So it's a good question. That's the first time I've had that. I want to say it's, sorry, Rob?
I don't think that would be covered. I think that would be similar to like a stock. We had a very similar question about merchandise. So again, I don't think through the musical instrument program, stuff like that would be covered. We can get a different standalone type policy for that stuff. But again, it would have to be on a case-by-case basis where we'd want to find out, is this like a vintage fine art collection of vinyl? Or is this more, I'm a band, we press vinyl and we sell it at our shows? So I guess it would be on a case-by-case basis. But online, through the portal, there isn't a section for vinyl or merchandise.
Just a thing to keep, thanks, Rob. A thing to keep in mind is, the program is set up in order to be able to reduce costs for musicians and, the different groups that are part of the program. The insurance companies, can't cover every single scenario or won't look at every single scenario under the program, only because if too many things are taken into account, or if there's, a whole bunch of different scenarios, then the cost could potentially go up because they could see as potential more risk. So this is, it's basically, they set up a box with, here's the most common things that a musician would be looking at using and doing, so that they can put that, into a formula basically and come up with the pricing. Like it was mentioned in one of the slides before, is like pricing on a standalone basis. If you're looking at purchasing the coverage, the insurance companies all have minimum premiums, and a lot of the minimum premiums start at $1,500, $2,000. Where again, under a program, because it's buying in bulk as the insurance companies see it, they can reduce that pricing, and having it be online as well, there's less touch to things, so the overhead costs for the insurance company are less. So again, which contributes to the lower cost of the premium for the policy.
I have custom built drums, but the company no longer exists. How could I get those appraised, or how would we determine the value of those?
So that's again, an appraiser can probably look at those. That's a perfect scenario as to say why you'd need it, because it's not going to be something that you can buy off the rack from somebody if you're looking to replace it with that. So the appraiser would obviously look at, if you were looking to get custom drums again, what the potential cost would be and in creating a similar kit to what you have.
I have both live gear and a home studio I use for online recording services. I keep my live gear stored in my garage and my guitars in my studio. What coverage scenario would apply to me?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? I'm just trying to understand it.
I have both live gear and a home studio I use for online recording services. I keep my live gear stored in my garage and my guitars in my studio. What coverage scenario would apply to me?
I think
So
it's a question about territory. Are they in two different locations? I mean, again, policies I would assume both are in Canada, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So the policy would respond. Does that,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Was that
Yeah,
the sort of,
that's fine.
hopefully that was the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I just bought a new computer mostly for the sake of music and video production. I'd like to insure it mostly to protect for additional damage or theft. Can you tell me a bit about this? I also bought some recording equipment which I may return but will eventually want to insure whatever I end up keeping. Is it easy enough to add on later, or will this complicate things?
So obviously the limits that you purchase are going to be, you're going to be charged based on that limit. If you are, and you should include the recording gear and the computer equipment that you're using into the value of into the question that's asked there for the value of everything. If you have a general idea of what your things that you want to purchase are going to be, and you're going to get it in a week or 2 weeks, or something in that scenario, quite honestly, it's best to include it in the beginning just so you don't have to come back. You can add things throughout the year, and then we determine what the additional cost would be for that. So again, it can be added if you have to make changes throughout the year. But again, if it's something that's coming, it's imminent, and you have a good idea of what what you're going to be paying for it, I would just include it, just so it's not forgotten, because that sometimes happens is people will, buy something or switch something out during the year, and then it's not top of mind necessarily to call the insurance company. And again, if something happens there, you can't add it at the time of the claim.
As a retired solo acoustic performer, I earn a very small amount in nearby retirement homes and local fundraisers, 4,000 to 5,000 a year. Is there a policy that just covers my guitar, amp, and mic, or do I have to pay the rate as if I was a touring full-time band?
So if you just again have the occasional thing where you're going to a retirement residence, that wouldn't be considered a tour necessarily. Again, unless it's something that's publicized in the sense that I'm going on tour. Here are my stops during this next 6 months, 4 months, what have you. If it's an occasional gig that you're doing, to cheer the retirement residents up, that wouldn't be, again, wouldn't be considered touring. So you could just purchase the coverage online, and it would, again, you'd be covering your guitar. And I don't know if the retirement residences look for you to have general liability, but sometimes that's something that's good to add on in the event that something happens. And again, we never think something's going to happen, but there's occasions where something could just even fall over if you have a mic or something else, and it could hit somebody in the head and again, who knows what could happen, but there are situations. So it's something that you might want to look at, including the liability on that.
Who is legally qualified to make an appraisal? Can a guitar tech do it?
You're going to find that there are specified like appraisers, and like they'll have their own company. They'll have their own qualifications to do it. So it can't just be,
A
someone,
member of your
yeah, a member of the band or someone else who, has shopped around for instruments and then thinks they have an idea of what pricing can be.
What does an average cost of an appraisal? What is an average cost of an appraisal?
Quite
no.
honestly, yeah. Quite honestly, we've
I think it would vary. Yeah, sorry, Diane. I think it would vary depending on the amount of stuff you're getting appraised, but that's not something the insurance company does. That's more for the client. Obviously, somebody who's got one piece of equipment to appraise is probably going to pay less than somebody who's got 50 pieces, I would assume.
Yeah.
And
Depends on where
probably based on
you.
Okay. Can you purchase just tour insurance? And if so, then what exactly does that cover?
So tour insurance isn't available under this program, under the online program. A separate policy needs to be purchased through insurance companies, and that's when you're getting into the minimum premiums. If you're buying, if you're going on tour, again, you're going to be looking at liability coverage. That's going to be a big component of it. And the insurance companies will look at things like staging, lighting, who's setting that up for you. Is there going to be any kind of build out of a stage or any kind of other structures? If there's going to be things thrown in the audience, if there's going to be any pyrotechnics. So the cost and the information that's required is a lot more extensive. And that's why, again, why it's not covered under the online program. And there's just, obviously, the size of the venue and how many people are there is going to be another factor.
Yeah, I've just to jump in there, Diane. I know that stuff that I've done depends on what territory, country you're going to. Will alcohol be served? Who's in charge of security? A stadium tour, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of mitigating factors that have to be addressed. So it wouldn't be something that you just are able to buy online through this program. It would have to be on a case-by-case basis, and premiums tend to be a lot higher than what's available online.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, everybody's seen the news and the different instances that have happened on different tours or different events that have happened. I mean, going back to stage collapses and things. So, not every insurance company writes these kinds of things. It's very limited in the types or the insurance companies that agree to write that kind of business. So it's not like car insurance where you can get an insurance quote from, 5, 6, 7, 8 different carriers. It's probably down to, quite honestly, this whole entertainment kind of related insurance is becoming harder and harder to get, and and the pricing has gone up. So it's something that as I mentioned, needs all the information, and again, there's limited companies to go to for it.
Okay, and just the last question here is the one about Kijiji. I don't think we addressed it. If they buy the musical instrument on Kijiji, is it insured if I paid for it in cash, etc.?
So
yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, it would be, you could include it in the value of equipment that you're buying. But again, in this scenario where, you're getting it for a deal because you're buying it used, you're going to want to insure it for a replacement cost than knowing what the full cost to replace it with something of like kind and quality. And, for proof of, should a claim happen, Having as much information as possible to prove ownership would be the best. So like Rob said, serial numbers, all that kind of stuff. And, if there's email correspondence with you and the person who's selling it to you, agreeing on the price, that kind of thing, that's what you're going to keep in your records.
What's the difference between tour insurance and your online coverage of the instruments when a musician is playing weekly?
So I think, again, tour would be, a scheduled, publicized scenario, I believe, with ticket sales with scheduled stops is the definition of tour, correct?
Yeah. So if you're going to a bar and you're performing at the same bar as a regular, then it necessarily wouldn't be covering considered a tour. But again, if you have something that you put on your website and then I'm going to this bar here and this, and next week I'm going to be at a bar in another province or another city, that kind of thing, it could be considered a tour.
Okay, so that's all the time that we have for questions right now. So if you have any additional questions, feedback, or if we didn't fully answer your question here, feel free to email us. You can find the emails on the URL that you see there on the slide. So the webinar has been recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available on Front Row's YouTube channel. Consider subscribing to us on social media. We do keep our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. up to date. So thanks to Diane and Rob for an informative presentation. And assuming the feedback on this webinar is positive, we'll probably do more webinars in the future, so be on the lookout for those. Thanks for listening, everyone, and have a good day.